Welcome, everybody, to the Left Reckoning bonus episode. I'm David Griscom, joined as always by my good friend and buddy. I guess that's a little redundant, but my good friend and comrade, Matt Leck. How you doing, brother?
Hello. I'm doing well, David. Good to be with you.
I mean, you could write like a good philosophical essay probably on the difference between like friendship and bud and buddy or budship.
I feel like the 19th century was like that, like friendship, buddy, yeah, exact chum.
I mean, honestly, like a lot of classical philosophy is like about friendship as a virtue. Anyways, we won't get into that today. We're going to talk about probably, we're going to focus a little bit on the Supreme Court, just because, we want to talk a little bit about what happened. I'm sure people are familiar this week, but also I think that this is probably one of the most immediate radicalization tools that we have, which is trying to break the kind of cult of the court. I think is one, like, strategically critical, as you know, as we always note that, like, I think the vast majority of progressive policy, let alone socialist policy, is going to run up against the Supreme Court at some point or another. So it's one of those things we need to start laying the groundwork for weakening that institution now. And two, it's also just one of those things that I think can sort of help move somebody from a, I don't know, more traditional, like, American liberal approach to politics to something that's a little bit more radical. But I don't know, before we get there, Matt wanted to bring on one of my favorite people who's in the FT to talk a little bit about climate change.
Well, this is actually just the FT. The FT doesn't, of course, sign their editorials. So this is just a piece that they wrote. And it's notable because it's the FT saying this. The FT, for people who don't know, is a very sort of establishment capitalist, but like a Wall Street Journal that's not Rupert Murdoch. Like, okay, I guess what I mean by that is, like, it's probably, I guess, if you had to lean one way, labor, Lib Dem sort of paper, but like it's, and it's the business press. So like, it's almost like a cliche at this point for like Marxists to be really into the FT, but
right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's undoubtable that out of the major business publications, it's probably one of the better one. I mean, frankly, I don't read too much of the opinion pieces in it generally, but even there, I mean, I think that there's just this is something that's intended for like domestic consumption, and what I mean by that, it's intended for people within that class. To be reading and understanding versus something that I think even the Wall Street Journal, even though it's expensive, I mean, like, is like a pure propaganda paper.
Right. Like, what was the Hal Draper concept where we have like political centers?
Yes. Yeah.
This is sort of the political center of like the Wall Street guy who's not like a bigot, sort of thing, but fully believes in like capitalism.
Or somebody who like does like, currency exchange. Like it's very internationalist too, like in content.
Exactly. And so like them coming to I'll just read what they say about climate change here. Capitalism won't deliver the energy transition fast enough. There's too much to do, and given the urgency and the need to get the solution right, this isn't a task for your favorite ESG, they really are equitable social governance or whatever that thing DeSantis is obsessed with, ESG-focused portfolio manager, or the tech bros. The sheer scale of the physical infrastructure that must be revamped, demolished, or replaced is almost beyond comprehension. Governments, not BlackRock, will have to lead this new Marshall Plan and keep doing it. The Western nations that did so much damage will have to finance the transition in the developing world. It is astonishing that this idea is still debated. Massive deficit spending will be necessary, not a new ETF. For all the clean tech advances and renewable deployment in recent decades, fossil fuel share of total global energy use was 86% in 2000 and 82% last year. And there's just a few things I would point out, which is the sheer scale of the physical infrastructure that must be revamped, demolished, or replaced is almost beyond comprehension. That is exactly what we need the business press to be helping people comprehend, or the press that deals with like keeping society running. On the other, and also like it is astonishing that the idea needs to be debated that we need to actually finance the parts of the world that didn't contribute to this mess for the past 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
But it shouldn't be a surprise, right? Like, who's throwing sand in the eyes? It's like organized, particularly fossil fuel companies, and dirty capital.
I mean, I think so, but also like there's an ironic kind of aspect to this too, wherein when it comes to climate change, I mean, and just like general government action, there is like this kind of ideological wall that we're running into, and by that I mean like neoliberalism. Joe Biden and the people in government even like don't think this way at this point, right? So like, yeah,
Yes.
like, yes, convince like the business folks, but like even the government is sort of like, oh, we're going to be able to do this through tax schemes and sort of, you know, nudges and things like that. And look,
Right.
I mean, I'd be curious to hear what you think about this, Matt. Like, because I would have two theories, you know, about it. Like, could it be, you know, purely like ideological in the sense that like they just think this is the way that government should, you know, do policy, right? Or has like state capacity been so degraded by decades of neoliberalism that like the ability to say we're going to launch a Green New Deal for like a Biden or something like that, beyond how he feels about it, him sort of maybe being like, we don't have the capacity or the capability to engage in a project like that. I mean, probably it's a little bit of both of those things, but I'm curious what you think.
I think you're right, and I think it actually is sort of, it leads to, it sort of ties in with what we're going to talk about next, is our inability to think about what the actual project is here, which isn't just managing a birthright of civilization. It's actually like creating and cultivating and then growing and, you know, nurturing progress of society and liberation of people. And so like, yeah, like Joe, like like again, I can't get over like Nancy Pelosi talking about the infrastructure thing is like, this is a once in a lifetime thing.
Yeah.
And that's, that could be read two ways, is, oh, to us, the naive way, which who is she is not fucking talking to. But we can hear that and be like, oh yeah, she recognizes that we have been not doing this for so long and we're finally doing it. Who she's actually talking to was the donors and saying, hey, I'm apologizing for as much as we're doing now, and we promise we won't come back for you later for more.
No, and like, you know, not only is that, I think, you know, just ridiculous to say in the sense of like something that should be your crowning achievement, and we all know the limitations of the IRA, you know, just with the infrastructure that is being sort of privileged and preferred under the IRA and like within like the green movement in general, being wind and solar, you know, that is sort of like let's just say we get the build out that people want, right? And I won't go into like all the problems with intermittency and things like that. The longevity of a lot of those systems is not forever, right? For a lot of these projects, like particularly in solar, we're talking like 10, 15 years before those things have to be replaced. So like if we were like, let's just say like we mobilized and got all the money and the tax credits work and everyone built it up. Well, that means in 10 years, we're going to start having capacity problems and we're going to have to replace all those things over and over again. So you would need to sort of constantly be making that social investment into those systems. Right. You know, for me, that's why I think the strategy should be building out renewables like wind and solar, and also having a strong base load by building up nuclear, because that lasts for a century or more. But you know, I mean, like even just like on like the kind of like scientific and physical limitations, there's like a very clear ideological horizon with the Nancy Pelosi, like we did our big climate change thing, and that's sort of it.
Yeah, and it's gonna be like, hey, look, we've done enough, and yeah, it's super depressing.
And like, look, I mean, you know, a lot of it is like, hey, Walmart's figured out a way to like get a tax credit from some activity that's almost completely separate, you know, from like the actual production and selling of their products, right? Because I mean, that's the thing that's really bizarre about a lot of these renewable credits. It's like, you know, I mean, don't forget this too. Like, this is how Tesla made a lot of money. Right. Was in selling the credits from its work to other companies, right? You know, like wind power works the same kind of way. I mean, everyone knows probably the famous Warren Buffett quote is like, the only thing that makes wind power work is the only thing that makes wind power profitable or interesting to invest in is the tax credits. You know, so he can utilize that to sort of offset costs to other businesses. Yeah, I mean, like it's truly like it's amazing to see in the FT everyone realizing that like, yeah, I think that this tinkering stuff isn't going to work. particularly at the scale and the speed that it will be necessary. It is pretty frightening when we're basically walking into a 2024 election where Biden is going to say, we got the job done on climate.
Yeah, man. Pretty grim stuff. But thanks, FT, for at least bearing witness. I mean, that's what we're doing these days, is just bearing witness.
And practice some joy.
I'll check out David's appearance on the Majority Report if they want to know what that's about.
Oh, man. Well, do we want to get to our boys? I mean, our boys and girls, our favorite unelected Council of Wizards.
Yeah, let's talk about the some of the other cases besides the student loan debt first.
Yeah.
Just to kind of get into one of the complaints I'm seeing a lot is Sharon Eiffel, former president, director of Legal Defense Council, NAACP, or Legal Defense Fund, NAACP, posted this, which a lot of people are commenting on. I'm curious what you think, but so let me understand. This is now a category of standing called She Worries, which allows a potential plaintiff to file a case in federal court simply for clarifying her rights. So basically, like, while Mrs. Smith has laid the groundwork for her new venture, she has yet to carry out her plans. She worries that if she does so, Colorado will force her to express views she doesn't agree with. And a lot of people are really upset with the basically fraudulent standing in these cases. Like basically just made up whole thought, not like what you would, at least in the I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill, or that what Schoolhouse Rock version of what the Supreme Court's supposed to be, where it's like, ooh, this small dispute of individuals going about their day-to-day life. It just so happens that there's a principle here. We've dispensed with that, and we can just like invent one as a thought experiment to take that up to the court. I gotta say, I think this is a change in degree, not in kind. I feel like the Supreme Court has been. I've got the impression this is how the Supreme Court's operated for most of my life, and I also think that even if it wasn't doing this, we should not have a Supreme Court. But I do think like it's useful to point out for how absolutely bullshit this is. Like, yes, anybody who thinks that there's a true like sort of law and order thing being represented by these people in robes, it does need to be disabused of that notion.
Well, I mean, look, two things. And just, for anyone listening, the case we're talking about is like what a Colorado website designer who, if I know, like wasn't like really even engaged in she was just saying like I might make wedding websites one day. I could be wrong about that, but if I remember correctly, that's the case. And the Supreme Court basically said, businesses can discriminate against gay people, queer people, which is like a devastating. I mean, extremely damaging. We have a brutal history in this country, and extremely frightening, ruling. But yeah, no, this point about how the court is even taking these cases. So traditionally, like it is supposed to be something that comes about after like an actual dispute, an actual impasse, versus like these kind of hypotheticals, right? And I agree with you, Matt, in the sense that like, if it is an actual case where some person, was refused service by this woman and, sued her, then it's still bad for the Supreme Court to basically be able to sit over society and make this decision. But I'll tell you this is exactly the kind of point that we're going to, be getting into, I think, throughout the segment, is this is the Supreme Court doing what the government and politicians never do, which is just reaching out and taking power. Because they have this feeling that like no one is going to stop them or challenge them on this. This is exactly how judicial review started, right? It was just a power that the Supreme Court assumed. This break from tradition, I think, is jarring, particularly knowing the ideological bent of of this current Supreme Court. But this is again the Supreme Court doing what it's very comfortable with doing, which is basically expanding its power, while a bunch of people on the sidelines sort of say, well, yeah, maybe this court is bad, but what about in the future when we had like the really good court and then the government was trying to do something really, really bad? And of course they have very, very little historical evidence to back up, how the Supreme Court would stop this nightmare situation from happening.
Right.
And there's ample evidence of the Supreme Court doing the exact opposite.
Yeah, I mean, again, like, you just like the Andrew Jackson thing, the one time it should have and really try to stand up for a threatened minority. It's like, who the fuck are you?
Yeah.
And that's what, and the reason that hasn't happened for like good is because of the hegemonic power of capital and, like actual who controls society. But like, that's what actually like, that's the only route forward. The other case was this affirmative action, case. Mm-hmm. And, like, again, I think absolutely, I'll just post this tweet here by, I can't even pronounce this name at all. PHYIYCRTYL on Twitter. But I think this puts it well and judiciously. Affirmative action has been dead in the water for some time. We should focus on abolishing the university as an apparatus for military research and the reproduction of class society, e.g. no grades, no degrees, no tuition, complete student and faculty self-government. My hot take, that's the interesting utopian take there. But this is the one here. I think we can afford to be dialectical about affirmative action. It was a decent attempt at fulfilling liberal, never radical goals of diversifying the middle class, which, as we can see, has failed to solve racism. So it's time we take a more radical approach.
I think that's well put. And like, we can maybe talk a little bit more about affirmative action in this case in general, but it reminds me of something that I think Vivek Chibber has said on like a lot of like the liberal kind of focus on like diversity what's the line, right? Like, black faces in high places.
High places, yeah.
Right. Is this idea is like, okay, this is how we can sort of like rectify a lot of historical wrongs. I think that like Vivek Chibber said something along the lines a few years back that I really identify with, and I think is correct, is that, look, like university politics or even like elite politics are actually extremely valid for people in those situations. So what I mean by that is, like, if you work in a company and the company is very clearly discriminating against women or people of color from having high positions, that is an extremely valid thing for you, or like even as a member of a larger group, to say, hey, this is wrong and we should change that, right? But the substitution happens when these kind of elite politics, right, or politics about like who should get the shares of, power and privilege in the society, gets sort of substituted for radical mass politics. And that is, I think, the substitution that like a lot of people on the left and a lot of people right for Jacobin are critical of. And I think I think that that's a really clear way to put this distinction out, because I think a lot of people mishear, an Adolf Reed or other folks when they say like, yeah, these kind of boardroom politics don't represent like a solution to, to capitalism or to racial inequality, or, economic inequality in this country. They represent like a very valid claim. Like, just condense the room for a second. Don't even think about society. It's just like 20 people in an institution. There's a bias there. Yeah, it's actually very correct for people who are being discriminated against in that situation to say, hey, that's wrong. But zooming out on society, saying this is the site of political struggle, that's where these substitutions, I think, become a little harmful for politics.
Yeah, and you see this, and like it's not that it's bad, but it should be it does reveal something that the Democratic Party is more comfortable saying. Like I saw Biden say, the student loan thing will put more stress on black and brown people, and like that's true. Guess what? Black and brown people are disproportionately larger part of the working class. Why doesn't he just say working class? God forbid some white working class people who had to take out loans from fucking users get relief here. And like that is a allergy to class politics, and it's a very obvious one why someone like Joe Biden would have it.
And look, I'm sorry, it's just because I think it's very obvious that the modern Democratic Party project, doesn't come from a critique of, capitalism and like wealth and like privilege. It comes, it doesn't think that those systems are wrong. It just thinks that like those systems aren't representative enough of people, right? And like, affirmative action, like why is that something that people like care a lot about, right? Why is it so important? It's because we have a system of accreditation in the society that if you go to these kind of elite universities, you might not be, and it's becoming less so, but no, I'm sorry, like media world
You're
that
set.
you and I both know very well, like professionally, is like almost everybody in there went to an elite university.
You want to know how good what an elite university can do for you? If you want to be one of these people who are on an editorial board writing against student loan relief, you will have to be an Ivy League person. Go check any of their credentials.
And it's like there's lots of industries in this country. That are like that. So like, okay, so these systems, these, high, like the Ivy Leagues essentially, right? Act as accreditation, like literally a stamp.
Yep.
It's not even that the education there is necessarily better than what you could get at like a public university.
I didn't go to Ivy League, but I did go to NYU, which is a private university, like in that sort of adjacent area. And I went to Minnesota State University, and like the main difference is the wealth of the people that you go to school with.
So, so what these end up being is like, this is a stamp of like approval, of like economic approval for you to be able to get access to jobs, and potentially build wealth for yourself. So yes, on like an individual level, this is like a massive deal, right? If you can get access to those universities. On a systematic level, like it doesn't help out. And like, I think Corey Robin and a lot of other people have been making this point, which I think is correct. Like, if we really wanted to deal with, like, for example, racial inequity in like American society and education, what we should be doing is nationalizing those private institutions, right?
Yep.
Right. If like the argument is like these do provide a certain level of education that is sort of necessary for society that is untouched by other public institutions, nationalize those, and also fund the schools where predominantly Black and working class communities go and get their education.
Yes.
Right. So like, anyways, anyways, that's like the more materialist, like socialist argument. Again, I don't see, for example, like the end of affirmative action. You have to be able to be dialectical about this in the sense of like, oh, well, this is not some kind of like radical or egalitarian ruling. This is like a very clearly like anti-Black, achievement, like rule. Like they're trying to block more and more people out of those institutions, saying we're done doing that at this point. We want these schools to be more representative of like the traditional white working class. I'm sorry, white ruling class in this country, right? So like being dialectical is being able to say like, oh, this doesn't portend well for like American society and American politics, but also saying that like, yeah, the thing that is being threatened right now, was never going to be able to achieve what its kind of stated goals were, and it's important to be able to understand both truths at the same time.
And I think you'd be hard pressed to find people from any community that wouldn't admit, like, I appreciate the system that will reward folks who from underinvested in communities who do achieve a certain level of merit with getting into an Ivy League. But way better is like what David said, is not having that community underinvested in the first place. And I think anybody would take that trade-off unless you are just, extremely like, elite minded person from that community, which happens. And
it's going to be interesting to see what ends up happening. I mean, the way the ruling is written is that like the schools can't accept, can't use like people's race to sort of influence, processes. I'm sorry, admission, but they can, and it's carved out how like racism has affected your life can be considered as like a part of like character, right? So that means that like there still is going to be a place if people use, for example, in their admission essays, things like that. And Harvard has basically come out and said that like, look, we saw this, it's here, so we're going to still consider it, which is, creates its own kind of traps and issues as well, right?
Because they'd rather do that than go after legacy admissions, which are a much bigger admissions factor and a much harder one to defend, which is a lot of these places were segregated, and you can get in if your family was in.
It might be interesting. I don't know if you've seen this. Maybe it's just sort of like a home thing here, Matt. But one of the arguments that a lot of people have been making is that like if they get rid of, now that it's over affirmative action, maybe universities that might want to pursue, and like I think, for example, some of the attacks on DEI on the state level in Texas are going to have pretty serious negative effects for both like staff and for students. But one of the things that people were saying is that, like, well, maybe, we could revisit how we do this entire admission process, and maybe move to a system like we have in Texas, which actually ends up encouraging and retaining and getting a very diverse student body at the University of Texas, because all public high school students in Texas, if you're in the top 10% of your graduating class, you get admitted to the University of Texas. Right. And, which means that, like, you actually have pretty significant representation of Hispanic and Black students there, that actually, I think, even in a way that might be surprising for folks, might even overrepresent those populations in the like in contrast to, like, their population size, because people who really plug themselves in and work hard in their high schools have a lot of opportunity to get admitted to school. Also, you have schools that are, like, very diverse in general in this state because of the way that the population is set up. So maybe that might be a system for, like, universities that want to maybe continue pursuing a more diverse, as a goal, a more diverse student body. But again, I don't know. I don't find that to be a particularly radical solution, but I thought it was an interesting point that people were making.
Yeah, I mean, that's way better than this crazy shit they have over here on the East Coast with private institutions, stuff like that. Like, I'm spoiled. I'm from one of the few states that has income mobility equaling that of Canada in this country, which is North Dakota. And in part, that's because North Dakota isn't as unequal of a state. It doesn't have the extreme wealth, particularly. It has poverty, particularly on reservations. But, like, there's one public school in my hometown. The rich kids in Marina Bay went to it, and the poor kids in trailer parks went to it. And, like, that is how I think society should be. I don't think, and again, Catholics went to a different school there that was a little bit wealthier. So a little bit, but, like, that is good, and you should be around a whole bunch of different types of people. Like, it's crazy to me how allergic people are to public school out here. And, like, I understand that actually there's a material reason for that they're underinvested in. So, like, you're doing what you can for your kid, and you see that metric, and you want to get your kid in that other school. But the world shouldn't be like that. That's dystopia.
Mm-hmm. And, like, again, like, for people who might not be familiar with the Texas, system, basically a few decades back, one of the U.S. courts of appeals blocked using affirmative action in college admissions. So the effect was immediate. About enrollment of Black and Hispanic students that dropped significantly. So this scheme of like admitting the top 10% of students in the state of Texas at their high schools was a way to get around it that ended up having very, very successful effects in, like, increasing the diversity of who's able to attend colleges in the state of Texas. I think one thing that I think is going to be really damaging, though, is the attack on things like DEI in the state of Texas for universities, because one thing that while you see, like, relatively, like, diverse student body compared to, like, other states here, the hiring of professors is not that diverse, right? And that's a massive problem. And, like, basically denying universities the ability to consider race and background as part of their hiring process, I think, is going to have a lot of damage in the University of Texas system. So, not saying it's all, beautiful and great over here, but rather that this was a way that they tried to get around it a couple decades back when what is now, like, a national policy was sort of enacted locally here. But yeah, like, the thing is.
Go ahead. No, I was just gonna say we went to student loans, sir.
Sorry,
I was just gonna say if you were done, we could switch to student loans. But if you had another
student loans, because I wanted to, like, keep on the Supreme Court too. In general, because, like, the point is, it's like this shit is just being decided by a bunch of random psychos, which is just not a good way to do policy.
Yeah, exactly. I'll read into the record again what I read yesterday, but this is from A Second-Rate Democracy, and this is just something that I think blows people's mind because we don't envision the power of ideology, frankly, an ideology that we've inherited for like 200 plus years. But they are right. Many Americans will probably be surprised to learn that some other leading democracies do not consider judicial review as a necessary part of a democratic system and do not give that power to their courts. In Great Britain, for example, their highest court does not have the power of judicial review. Its job is to rule on decisions made by the lower courts, not to rule whether laws passed by Parliament are valid. New Zealand has no judicial review, and the Constitution of Netherlands explicitly forbids it. I would look into how they did that. That might be an interesting story. Finland, Luxembourg, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland managed to get along without it as well. In these countries, it is thought that the legislature, the elected representative of the people, is the most appropriate arbiter of constitutional issues. It is seen as undemocratic for the views of unelected justices to override the views of legislators who represent the will of the public. Imagine that.
What's a fascinating idea? No, I mean, look, I'm like a democracy supremacist in general. I think that like the legislatures should be the most powerful bodies, and that doesn't guarantee, good outcomes necessarily. But the idea that you're going to have anything other than that be representative or fair or correct is just, I think, ahistorical and I think philosophically wrong. Because it like those concepts of like, oh, well, we need basically, and like going back to what we were talking about a second ago about elites. I mean, like, the people who get into these positions don't represent the American public. They represent the elites, right? You don't get considered for those kind of things if you haven't been, in the elite world. Like, some folks like, might be able to get into those elite rooms from more marginalized backgrounds. True. But again, they still have to live within those worlds for a very long time before they get considered for a position like that. No, so I think 100%, like, you need to have power as close to the people as possible. And, it's bizarre that in a country that sort of like celebrates like the length of American democracy and things like that, that it's controversial with some to say that like, yeah, I think that the elected body should basically be where these conversations end. Because whenever you try to take anything outside of politics, the people like mass politics, the people who have influence aren't the representatives of like mass political movements. They are the representatives of private power, particularly like the power of capital, which is why these things were set up in the first place.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that making that point is really good, Matt, because like, sometimes people get very American centric where like it's all these thought experiments, right? It's like, well, how could a system ever work if we didn't have a Supreme Court?
But what the implicit sort of the mind virus that little idea is uploading in your head is that the people cannot be trusted, that they actually need a check on them. And like, this is the thing, and people bring up all the attack on trans people. The attacking trans people would not be nearly the electoral issue it is today if the Supreme Court hadn't gutted Voting Rights Act, hadn't like basically set up a voting system that is preferable to say evangelicals in certain areas. Like, right. Like ultimately, like these things need to be fought for and won, and they can be. Like, we could get people on the side of these things, and we cannot trust, no matter how good Ketanji Brown Jack's dissents are, that body as the guardian of it, because you saw what happened with that with Roe, is the second that actually the march could be going on to roll that back, which I don't know that it could have been in the 90s. I honestly think, like, for all the credit Democrats give themselves for the turnout against Roe here, I think it would have been stronger 25 years ago.
Probably.
Maybe I'm wrong about that. And but like, yeah, I don't know. Like, and so it failed.
And look, I think that like fundamentally, it's just like doing the thought experiment, right? There's always these kind of, worries about like, well, if we open up like all questions to like mass democracy, isn't there a potential of abuse? Yeah. There's already an example of like abuse that's going on across the country right now where, millions of women are unable to get health care. Many of them are dying or having severe complications because of that. Right. Yep. So in no way, shape or form does this kind of system prevent that we currently have prevent, for example, like abuses of the majority against the minority, right? Which is the kind of classic like civics room conversation about the court. It doesn't protect people from those. And no, I don't think that necessarily in every single case, for example, like opening up things to like, you know, a stronger democracy would mean that like there would never, for example, be really bad laws that were passed. But you know, the difference is that those can be directly influenced and people have a political avenue to fight back and push back against them,
Right.
instead of these kind of esoteric arguments that we have to have whenever the Supreme Court does something that is completely out of line with mass public opinion on these issues.
Yeah.
And sorry, Matt, like just getting heated about this, but like it also pulls these things into the real world. And what I mean by that is like abortion, for example, is something that has just been debated in this country forever, even after Roe v. Wade, right? People had strong opinions on it one way or the other, but the political avenue to like influence it or to do something about it, to cement it as a right or to roll it back, was always severely like limited politically. And it just lets those things sit in society instead of ever being settled in some way or another. And the thing about the American system that is unique, compared to other countries on social issues in particular, is things move very fast. So like you can have a country where like, you know, abortion is, you know, the law of the land, and then in like a year's time have it where it doesn't exist anymore. Same thing with, you know, gay marriage or things like that, right?
Defensive Marriage Act. Yeah. 2004, Bush was going for Defensive Marriage Act constitutional amendment. Less than a decade later, we're running up the scoreboard on states legalizing it.
And what that means is that, like, yeah, you can get like victories very quick potentially, right? But it also means that those questions are never settled. And if you lose at any one particular moment in the political makeup, it's like back to zero, right? Instead of, you know, having to have those things maybe be like chipped away slightly, or to have like, for example, on abortion, like have some kind of right-wing restrictions on it, right? Which, you know, is bad, but that's, for example, would be preferable to like a virtual ban on abortion in a lot of states in this country, right? By like holding it in this way, it actually puts all of these things in a constant state of like eradication threat, in a way that like if these things were sort of being these battles were sort of being fought out in Congress or something like that, it would never be that kind of one final victory, you know, kind of thing.
The Supreme Court is currently licking its chops to like take the EPA's ability to regulate pollutants away, right? Like that shit happened in the 70s. So yeah, you know, if you think that, and look, I'm not against, if you want to put a whole basketball team full of Ivy League liberals on the court, if you can do that, do it. I'm not going to say don't do it. Okay. That's not the route that I think that people should take. It fundamentally shows disrespect to the institution as one that you could game whatever. Fundamentally, you should not have that body sitting above the legislature.
Yes. I mean, I think that's sort of it. And like, remember that this is a long American tradition of the left, particularly like the socialist movement, recognizing that, you know, the Supreme Court represents the entrenched power of capital. It physically embodies like the power of like previous generations, right? When you're talking about, you know, you can crystallize particular moments in American history with like Supreme Court appointments, right?
Yes, sorry, but the GOP is literally like picking guys that are in their 40s so that they do that.
So that like, you know, in 20 years from now, we still have like the specter of that one election in 2016, right? It's a bad way to sort of set up politics. And again, like, remember, like, you know, the Supreme Court, this is the institution, you know, that let Eugene Debs go to prison. You know what I mean? Like, these are forces that have been used to support some of the most brutal aspects of the American state in ways that were wildly unpopular, and certainly incorrect. And, you know, like, I don't know, like, it's bizarre to me that we still have to continue to have this conversation about whether or not we think this is a good system. You're seeing it play out very clearly why it's not working today, but it's always been something that's been a kind of funky and fuzzy idea for a country that considers itself to be a democracy. Now, I mean, like, unless you want to look at any other cases, Matt, like, we could maybe talk about like what we want to do about it, right? because yeah.
One note just on where we're at with the student debt thing.
thank you.
There's this thread from David Dayen. So according to the president's words, they're going to create a new program, I presume, with the same parameters under the Compromise and Settlement Authority of the Higher Education Act that we discussed as the main way to cancel student debt 4 years ago. And Dayen continues, but I'll just say this. At the very least, that review process would have to happen. Basically, there's some bureaucratic stuff. At most, the secretary would have to go through the FCCS program. Either way, it will take time. And David says what is the most important point to anybody that is saying the Biden is doing his best and just trying his hardest. Dan says, that's why clearing this regulatory underbrush should have been done January 2nd, 2021, not 3 years in. And everybody who's advocating for this debt collective, like this is what people were saying at the time. And they, again, like whether or not like who intentionality, if maybe Biden thought to go through, or like I don't know who's making the decisions there. What happened was they got people on the hook for repayments by getting their details in, and then they didn't get the debt relief. Okay. And they set it up in a way that just obviously was challengeable by for this exactly the Supreme Court thing. So yeah, I mean that's where we're at.
And they're setting it up again too, from my understanding, from talking to some of the folks in the debt collective, in a way that is like, is not impervious, for example, for maybe some of these legal challenges again. Right. So like, and it's going to be a slow process, as Biden was very clear making yesterday. They'll
make PPP jokes, but they're not going to actually do anything about the student loans.
And it's just like it's truly devastating, and like a massive strategic blunder. To be sort of opening these things up consistently to right wing attacks. I mean, we talked about this last week during the post game, right? It's just like, like the way that they do policy, they always act as if, it's a big surprise that we're going to get like a pushback from the right on these kind of things. And they open themselves up to these kind of attacks and rollbacks of their policies. It's extremely damaging. It's extremely dangerous. And like, yeah, everyone's been getting mad at the debt collective and progressives for saying like, oh, well, now you guys are mad that they're using the authority that you asked them to do like back then. It's like, well, yeah, they're doing it in a way where they're not utilizing the aspects of that provision to protect themselves from legal challenges, and very likely will face another one because of the way that they're setting up these systems. Just eradicate the debt. Full stop. None of this means testing bullshit. None of this parameters around it, because that is how you get these attacks.
Yeah. And Dan said, he was elaborating the debt collective's theory, whatever, basically that you wipe it off the books and then make the Supreme Court put it back on. Yeah. And, Dan made the point that, they did it sort of this time. They might not be afraid to do it the next time. Good. Make them do it next time, because you know what that also says? The Supreme Court just gave you $80,000 back on the books, right? Like that is that's useful for where we're trying to get.
I think so. And like, this is sort of like gets us to this question of like what to do about the Supreme Court. Look, there's the big argument right now is that we should expand the court. That's the one that seems to be the most palatable to people in power and liberals. I don't think it's very palatable to Biden, by the way. I think it's more palatable to like Democratic Party commentators than anybody.
I don't know that it's palatable to Bernie. I mean, I kind of Google if he's updated, but he's been kind of.
I mean, Bernie doesn't like the expand. I mean, if I remember correctly, back in when he was running in 20, Bernie said that he believes that the Constitution gives does not sort of designate that the appointment to the Supreme Court itself need be a lifetime appointment. It is a lifetime appointment to the judiciary, but you can cycle justices from the Supreme Court to some of the appellate and appeals courts, right? So his argument was always that that's what we should do. I don't know. I want to get to the more radical one, and then maybe start with like these ones. The Bernie one. Look, if that's a power that somebody can get, fine. To me, it works like in the same way. Expanding the court and the cycling of justices does two things that I think are beneficial, right? One, it breaks this current impasse that we have, just the math of it, right? Which I think is like the immediate desire that people have. But two, what it does is something that they always cite as a negative, but I think is a positive, is it perverts the institution, right? It makes the institution feel more political, which, by the way, friends, it is. So,
It is.
like, I think there are better strategies to do than that. But look, if anything starts to break the kind of mental hold that institution has on certain people, that's beneficial, right?
Yep.
I think that fundamentally you need to recognize one of the fundamental weaknesses of the court is that it does not have enforcement capability, right? The enforcement capability is controlled by the executive branch, because like in any legal system, you have the judiciary, but then you also need to have like the state apparatus enforce those things. So like if somebody goes to jail, you put them in jail. You have a police officer physically arrest them, right? That is a power that is, influenced by the courts, but that power actually resides outside of the courts themselves. So recognizing that they don't have the enforcement capability, you have the cards in your hands. So like going back to the student loan thing, eradicate the debt. Everyone's debt zero, right? Hell, and then burn the books too, right?
Yeah.
Right. And then the Supreme Court says, actually, Biden, you can't eradicate the debt. And then Biden says, fine. I mean, okay, like, you don't want to set up the system to repayment system and the bookkeeping system, right? They don't have that power. In the same way that the Supreme Court, as we were just saying, with the student loan case, right, which again, as David Dane and other people have pointed out, it was the institution that was sort of brought into the case didn't even want to sue about it. Right. The court was overextending themselves on these, on both that case and on the gay rights case with the Colorado website designer. So yeah, put the ball in the, take that power away from the Supreme Court and then say like, yeah, you guys deal with this if you want to do it so badly.
Yeah, former guest of the show, Kelsey Atherton. If I were president, I would simply not collect debts that court asks me to collect. John Roberts has spoken, let him send his debt collectors. And that's, of course, a reference to Andrew Jackson, saying like, hey, you want me to not dispossess a Cherokee? Well, what are you going to do about it? And yeah, like that, exactly. Like it's a political problem. It's not a formal bureaucratic one. And like people just need to, I think like, look, all these things are moonshots, fucking solving climate change, but like, we need to at least orientate ourselves in a proper direction. And it's not, to me, like trying to figure out how the best to have a body of unelected judges that get to decide what's constitutional based on Harvard or whatever the fuck. Like, it's bringing this back into politics.
And I think that's just like I think this is why, some people get frustrated with the points that we're making, but I'm sorry, we're right. Because like it is politics, and like you can either make the decision to sort of say we're going to go along with the Supreme Court because for some reason we're finding the need to have fidelity to a certain kind of conception of American politics and American government is more important than actually like materially benefiting millions of people. Right. That's the decision that's being made right now by the Democrats, is that like, we're going to hold fidelity to this idea versus actually delivering the things that we promised to people. And yeah, it will take political struggle to break the power of the Supreme Court. It is not something, without like consequence and politics and political consequences and all of that kind of stuff. But it fundamentally is going to have to take a different orientation. So if that orientation is fast in a straight up denial, as we were just talking about, which I think would be the more radical and correct approach, two things like, we're going to come up with a scheme that sort of devalues the court in people's minds. All of those things, if you're weakening the power of this institution over American democracy, that is a beneficial thing. And like, yeah, you just said it though, Matt, like all these things are moonshots, right? Right? Like dealing with climate change, healthcare in this country, all of these things are going to have resistances at some point. And basically in politics, you have to make a decision sooner or later whether or not you are going to accept those resistances or whether you're going to plow through them. And it pushes things You know, in like it makes these questions very political, but so is again like the absence of action on these things.
Yeah.
And you know, we need a fundamental reorientation. I mean, look at another problem. I think the presidency is certainly overpowered in this country, right? You know, I think a very classic example that people know is that like Congress is the institution that has the ability to declare war. Right? I mean, how long has it been since that has been the case in this country? That was a power that the presidency just took for itself, and the legislature should take that power back. And like, there's a fundamental weakness, I think, in vision, particularly of like the legislature, you know, to sort of assert its power over these other institutions, be it the presidency or the Supreme Court. And it's something that I think is desperately needed.
Yeah, couldn't say it better. Oh, you know, there's one other thing I wanted to tack on the student loan thing, just because that's also a principle, and you can get sucked into like arguing over Pell Grants and this or that means test. But Tracy McMillan Cotton put it this way, and I think this is very succinct. Student loan debt cancellation is not writing the borrower's wrong, but admitting the state's wrong. And this idea that we graduate teenagers and then say, hey, your future, but first talk to this guy in a suit and sign here is fucking appalling. It should be a huge shame, especially when you have the housing, the U.S. Department of Education putting out suicide awareness shit.
Yeah.
And because you know what they know? They know what the science says, which is that indebtedness causes 2.5 times like more higher suicidality. And so, I mean, this is not people who like want to get in the weeds. But look, your family members, people who are like, that's different. I mean, media people. I mean, professionals in the political class. Absolutely no quarter about this.
Yeah. And you know, no, I mean, I totally agree. And like, this is also like a very clear political lesson, I think, in why like all these programs should just be universal. And the willingness to sort of undermine these things with like means testing is both like legally dangerous in the sense that like it allows like these courts to sort of break and carve them up, but it's also politically dangerous because like when you create benefits that only go to some, then there will always, like, it could be justified or not justified, right? But it makes these things so much harder, so much easier to attack, right?
Yep.
And like, you know, even talking about, for example, the system in Texas when it comes to admissions, that like 10%, the top 10% of students get admission into the University of Texas system. Well, that also makes it very unassailable as well, right? In the sense of like, look, this is merit. Everyone has the same opportunity to go, right? It just so happens that, you know, it sort of has a stronger representation of marginalized people. You know, white people in Texas are a large, but a minority at this point. So I don't want to use the word minority, right? Like, you know, the point is like, if that's something that's available to everybody, that just makes it really hard for a Republican to basically say like, oh, it's really unfair that the top 10% of like high school students get to go to our elite university in the state, right? Like, it's just like, you can't make that argument with a straight face. You know, all of these things, like, it's something that Richard Wolff, I think, makes this point a lot too. It's like, this is why universal programs just politically are just always going to be stronger. If this is something that is seen as a public right and a public good for everybody, it's a lot harder to attack it than it seems if it's a kind of particular privilege, even if it's a privilege or an opportunity that's going to historically marginalized people. Just politically, it's basic politics that makes something for everybody. It's a lot harder to attack these kind of things.
Yeah, I mean, you had Republicans acting offended that Joe Biden suggested they were coming after Social Security like a few months ago. And it's like, right, like exactly. Because, you know, occasionally a Democrat like FDR will recognize certain things like that. But
well, folks, thanks for hanging out with us in this bonus episode. Tell your friends to check out Left Reckoning, patreon.com/Left Reckoning if they want to listen to our great insight on the Supreme Court and how we can get out of this quagmire.
Yeah, and David's going to be off for the coming weeks here. I mean, not for this Tuesday. We'll have our discussion, but There'll be some North Dakota content,
Hell yeah.
or upper